Hi, my name's Leo and I'm a boat builder and a sailor. A few years ago I bought a very old and quite famous wooden sailing yacht for the price of $1, and since then I've been rebuilding that boat from the keel up with the help of a lot of amazing people. Now this video is about a lot of different projects which are going on right now, mostly to do with the engine room and the systems that are getting installed there, but we're also going to be taking a look at the fairing of the deck, which is very satisfying as Zeal is going to sand off the black seam compound and reveal the beauty of the deck planks underneath. The first job we're going to look at though is the installation of the heater, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, but the first thing that needs to happen is Nick is going to drill a pretty large hole in the transom of the boat.
Oh! There it is. Oh my God. Real carefully.
So having some kind of heating on board a sailing boat is really nice, especially if you're spending time in cold or wet climates. In all my previous boats, I've just had a small wood burner, which kind of sounds like it might be sketchy in a wooden boat, but actually if you're careful, it can be pretty safe. And wood burners give a really nice dry heat and atmosphere, but they're not always practical if, for instance, you're at sea or in an area where you can't find wood. For this boat, I really want to be able to go on long adventures in inhospitable areas. I love high latitude sailing, and I'd like to be able to spend long periods of time in cold areas where there may be no firewood. So after looking at a lot of different options and doing a lot of research, we decided to go for a hydronic diesel heater. The word hydronic just means that heat is transported through the space from the small diesel furnace by using circulating hot water. The actual heater that we're using is a really cool unit, and it comes from a company called ITR. We're going to talk more about that later, but first of all we need to install the exhaust itself. The heater itself will be installed in the engine room, so we have to run the exhaust from there through the lazarette bulkhead towards the transom. We have to do a gooseneck loop to stop water going back up it, and then it'll come through the transom itself.
So Joe fabricated all the exhaust, the stainless exhaust, and I machined one coupling while he was fitting it all up, and I just tacked it in place. And Joe's gonna bring it to me in the shop and I'll weld it out.
Bit a little bit tight in the lazarette there?
No, I'd sleep in there for sure.
It's gonna be the warmest, driest place in the boat.
Oh yeah, I bet.
What are you up to in there, Joe?
Well, I'm just finishing up the fit up for the exhaust for the heater. Yeah, I fit it all in here. Nick put the through hull on the transom, and Dylan just came in and tacked all the pieces together using a TIG welder. And I'm going to pull it all apart and put it on Dylan's bench, and he can weld it out, and then we'll reassemble it for a final assembly. We have it coming through the bulkhead at kind of an odd angle, but that worked out better with the installation of the heater, and then also space in the lazarette.
So Tally-Ho's engine room is going to get really quite crowded. We're trying to put a lot of stuff in there. For a start, the cockpit is going to go in the boat soon, and that's going to take away a lot of the space. We've also got the engine in already, of course. We've got inverters. We're going to be putting the heater in, a water maker, all the fuel plumbing systems, and a bunch of other stuff too. To make best use of the space, George has made some big plywood panels which mount to the inboard faces of the diesel tanks, and that means we can easily fasten things like plumbing, cables, filters, housings to the tanks via the plywood panels. Now I mentioned putting a water maker into the engine room, and if you're not familiar, that is a device which takes seawater from the ocean and it puts it through a series of pumps and membranes and filters, and it gives you fresh, clean drinking water, as well as a waste brine which will go back overboard. Water makers do consume power, of course, but the particular type of water maker we're using uses an energy recovery pump, which uses a lot less power than a lot of other water makers. Now, having a water maker is a really nice luxury, but not essential by any means. It's quite possible to make long offshore passages without it and just carry enough drinking water. But having one, especially if you're living on the boat for long periods of time, is nice because it means you can shower and so on, and you don't have to be so reliant on picking up water in marinas, in harbors, especially if you're in places where you might not be so sure about the water quality. It can also let you stay offshore for much longer periods of time, as long as the water maker is functioning. But of course, anytime you go offshore, as well as your water maker, you're going to be carrying enough drinking water so that you can always complete your voyage if the water maker breaks or stops working. Now, I've worked on a lot of boats with water makers. I've never owned one myself, but on Tally-Ho, we have the power we need. We don't have huge water tanks, and we have the space in the engine room, I think. So we decided to go for it. George has been given the task of making the bracket that's going to hold the main parts of the water maker to the hull.
I am working on getting the last of the wiring done on the inverters before the cockpit goes in, because my life is going to get a lot more difficult when I can't stand up in here. Just trying to get as many of the connections connected before that happens, which might be within a week or so.
So in previous episodes, you will have seen Clifton building up the cockpit footwell, which is a sort of one-piece box that is going to go in the deck, and is going to be where you put your feet when you're in the cockpit, steering the boat, operating the winches and so on. Now, this piece has been ready to go in the boat for a while, but we've been holding off to allow more work to happen in the engine room, but it has to go in soon because we need to lay the deck over the top of it. So it's going to go in very soon now, but before we actually put it in, Zeal has started sanding the deck. Now he's using a big sander to sand off the TDS, the Teak Decking Systems caulking compound, which we put in the seams on top of the cotton. And while he's doing that, he's also going to be fairing the deck planks, making them more smooth and even. The deck, of course, is made of Alaskan yellow cedar for the main deck strakes and teak for the king planks and covering boards. And once it's sanded and we can see those nice sharp lines of the seams, it should make a really nice contrast between the black seams, the darker teak and the lighter yellow cedar. The deck is not going to be treated as is traditional on wooden decks. It's going to be left raw to grey out with time. There's a lot of reasons for that. It's generally considered to be the easiest to maintain and the most comfortable to use and to walk around on because it's not at all slippery. With a raw deck, it's just very important to make sure that it always gets salt water on it, especially after rain. The salt water keeps the deck tight, but it also stops any rot, whereas fresh water left on the deck will inevitably cause problems in the long run. So the cockpit is in the boat and it looks really good. We're going to take a much closer look at it above and below inside the engine room very shortly. But first we're going to check in with Nick, who's about to install the Triducer. Now that is a small sensor which goes on the outside of the hull and it measures the depth of the water, the speed of the water passing the boat, and the temperature of the water. The transducer needs to face vertically down to measure the depth accurately, and it's got to be mounted on the hull, which is at a very steep angle, so it needs to sit on a fairing block which needs to be modified to match the shape of the hull.
So over the last couple of weeks, I've been establishing some major wire runs, and one of them is going to the engine room for the engine room lights. Yeah, it's good timing because the cockpit's in and the rest of the deck is going on and it's getting darker in the engine room.
Cool.
So Joe's gonna have some light to work with.
You want to switch it on for us?
Yeah. We have red lights.
Ooh.
And we have white lights. Brighter the better. When you're in an emergency situation, you don't want to be fumbling around in the dark. And for maintenance too. I mean, just being able to see if there's water or oil or anything happening that shouldn't be happening. Or when you drop something.
Yeah.
Which happens all the time in the engine room.
Cool. Looks great, Erica.
Thanks.
Good job.
Thank you.
So yeah, Joe, can you just give us a bit of an overview of the major stuff that's been happening in the engine room in the last couple of months?
Yeah, you bet. Well, it was kind of a big push because we knew the cockpit had to go in at some point, and it was a lot easier to work in there with the cockpit out as far as moving big components in and out of the engine room. So kind of focused on getting big stuff in and mounted and taking care of some of the electrical and plumbing runs that were going to get difficult with the cockpit in place. We put in the heater. A big part of the heater installation was the exhaust system for it. It's very important that it doesn't have back pressure, not too many bends in it, so it wants to be as direct as possible. Can't catch anything on fire, and it goes through a storage space, so it has to be strong and yeah, well thought out. Bracketing for the heater, another big one. George did a lovely job making some very custom fit brackets to put it on. Water maker went in, same thing, trying to utilize all the real estate well. A very nice bracket from George, and bringing electrical in, and yeah, electrical to the inverters. They're all completely wired up from the shore power all the way through to the batteries. So that's exciting. We'll be turning stuff on here pretty soon. Not quite ready. I'm working on the last of the data connections. So I've been working underneath the companionway on the Victron stuff, getting the Servo GX hooked up with all the different data inputs to it. It's kind of the brains of that system.
So I'm sitting here in the engine room, and we've got a lot of our equipment in here now. There's not a lot more to go in here apart from plumbing and wiring. Cockpit is above my head, of course, and depending on your perspective and what you're used to, this is either a very small, tight, cramped space, or a huge expanse with amazing access to the machinery. And to me, it's more the latter, really, because I'm used to working in boats with very limited machinery space and very bad access. So it's pretty amazing to me that I can sit up in here and have access to all this different equipment around me. There's even going to be another sitting spot over there with a lot more parts and tool storage. So we've got the main engine down here, of course, with its hybrid motors attached, and behind it and above it are the main inverters. There is a lot more stuff to do in here. For instance, there's going to be a sort of heat shield and work surface above the engine to prevent the inverters getting too hot, as well as a lot of forced air ventilation through the engine room. The water maker system is all in this area, and it did take up more space than I had realized, but it's gone in, and it's a really sturdy unit that produces a lot of water and is very reliable. Over here we've got ELCIs, which are to do with the AC shore power, and then behind me we have the heater and the heater control unit here. Now the heater is from a company called ITR, International Thermal Research. It's called the Hurricane Zephyr, pretty cool name, and it's a very compact, rugged, well-made unit. I'm really pleased with it. So it burns diesel in here, but it can also run off electricity when you're plugged into shore power. And it heats up water for two purposes. One is for space heating. So that water is a closed circuit that is pumped around the boat. It can be optionally pumped through the engine if we decide to set that part of the system up. And then there'll be small radiators or fan heaters in the different cabins. There's different temperature control zones. The other function of this heater is to heat up the domestic water for showering, for drinking, whatever. So that will feed hot water to all the basins, the faucets, the taps, the sinks. I'm rolling my eyes because I caught myself saying faucets. Well, I should be saying taps. But anyway, this little guy puts out 33,000 BTUs, which is a lot of heat, and it doesn't use much diesel. So very cool. Behind me, we've got the fuel supply and return systems. So we've got these little manifolds which let you decide where the fuel is coming from in terms of which tank and where it's going to, in terms of the engine or the heater, and the same in terms of the return lines. We've got dual fuel filters for the main engine and a filter for the diesel heater as well. This filter is oversized. We've made the system so that if we want to add a fuel transfer and polishing system later, it would be easy to do, but I don't think we're going to do that initially. Up above, we've got some galvanic isolators for the shore power inlets. Over here, we've got the cooling system for the hybrid motors. We've looked a little bit at that previously. So yeah, that is about what we've got in here at the moment. Really pleased with the space, pleasantly surprised with the amount of headroom. And you know, I know all this stuff isn't traditional for a boat of this vintage and era, but I've always said this boat's not going to be a museum piece. It's going to be a world cruising, working, sailing vessel with hopefully some cool adventures and missions. And this stuff is fun and exciting to learn about and to install, and hopefully it's going to make those sailing adventures more pleasant, safe, fun, sustainable, practical in the long term. Tell us a little bit more about the ventilation system.
Yeah, it's a small space and a lot of machinery, so we thought about it a lot. It's hard in a sailboat because we want to keep the boat sealed up so that the ocean doesn't get in, but at the same time we need to get air into the boat, so a lot of thinking about that. So we have fans that are pulling heat, extracting heat from the top of the engine room, and we're gonna have a fan blowing air into the engine room and also air moving through the battery storage compartment. It's not a super elaborate system, but they'll turn on and off with temperature sensors and also a manual override. I think that everything's going real nice, and yeah, it's always, the real estate is such a commodity in all boats, and especially the quality of the build of tally-ho. We're not allowed to just slam things in, so really trying to retain serviceability, access, and get all the stuff in that we're committed to having in the boat. So yeah, it's a fun little puzzle.
Yeah. So I'm sitting here in Tally-ho's cockpit for pretty much the first time, and it's a pretty amazing feeling. Clifton did a really great job building the cockpit footwell, and great to see it go in the boat, and a major milestone really. Clifton's next jobs in this area will be to lay the deck inside the cockpit and to build the cockpit coaming cap rail. Inside the boat, the systems work is going so well. Really exciting to see the space in the engine room and see all that machinery in there. Another systems project which we weren't able to cover in detail in this video was the fuel tank vents. Joe made these up out of copper. They're really beautiful and clever design. They have a bore in this part which will block the vent if it's ever flooded. Patrick mounted these on the little teak blocks, and they'll go green in time, but I think they look really beautiful as well as functional. The deck also looks fantastic. Now it's sanded, it's so nice to see all those clean seams. We've got it all covered up now, of course, to protect it between now and launch, but there's so much more work to do before we can even think about launching. Some of the next jobs include putting the deck prisms in, mounting the winches, designing and making the tiller, continuing the work on the cap rails, and then there's all the interior joinery, and of course huge amounts of work to do on the rig. And that's just the first few things off the top of my head. But there is a light at the end of the tunnel now, and that's really exciting, really good for morale. So big thanks to the team here. Thank you for watching, and a massive thank you to everyone who has donated or otherwise supported this project. It does make a huge difference. It means we're able to keep on doing this work, and we're able to keep on making and editing these videos. So I really appreciate it. And I'll see you next time. Cheers.